perfect preschool. After months of hunting, this is the one. You go and talk to the admissions secretary. You walk out a little discouraged. With all the requirements, other moms pulling strings and inside connections, it seems impossible to even let your child set foot in this perfect place for the start of their education. So how can you possibly make sure your preschooler gets the best education available? Well, Teru Clavel is a global education consultant and author of the new book, World Class, One Mother's Journey Halfway Around the Globe in Search of the Best Education for Her Children. With her cutthroat experience trying to get her own children into the perfect preschool and her background as an education consultant, we thought she'd be the perfect person to talk to about this. Welcome, Teru.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
I think that no matter where anyone lives or who they are, we just want to make sure that our kids have the best start in life. And I'm wondering, in your perspective, what do you think are the best things that we need to make sure that our preschoolers specifically have so that they get the best education?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think the first thing that we all have to do as parents is to take a full inventory of what we ourselves have at home and what we can offer and what our values are, because then we can figure out what the best match is in terms of a preschool selection. So I think of it as this: if you are highly disciplined at home, do you want a school that's equally as disciplined or a little maybe more flexible? Or if you aren't able to be very academic at home in terms of reading a lot to your child or just spending a lot of time speaking to them, then maybe it's just, you need a school that's a little more academically focused. And then you have to look at your own schedule too, because it's possible that maybe you have a work schedule that means that you need to find a preschool that has longer hours, and then what is that school doing during its hours? And maybe there's preschool hours or post preschool hours, and then even before preschool, where there are a lot of families that are looking for daycare. And then it's also a matter of finding out what the certification is of that preschool, how the teachers have been certified and what their backgrounds are. And of course, a lot of it always comes down to the geography and how easy it is to get to and from the school and how much it costs, right? Because that's a huge
right.
factor. Yeah, I would say those are the main ones. Yeah.
It's a lot to consider for preschool. Do you feel like our expectations for what a preschool should provide are growing exponentially from generation to generation?
Well, that's a great question. I think that yes and no. I think what's happening is, there's a lot of neurocognitive science that shows that those early childhood education years are the most formative in terms of predicting future success. And that can be quantified literally as looking at the percentage of kids that may go into special ed. It's, if you have strong, or I should say quality early childhood education experience, then the chances of you going to special ed are reduced. And you don't have as much grade repetition. There are higher rates of high school graduation. And as a society, the return on investment is much greater. So that's all happening. At the same time as culturally, there are more kind of dual income earning families, right, where the parents aren't around as much. At the same time, you don't have as much of the same community supports as we had generations ago, right? So you don't have, and sadly, as we look at this whole kind of helicopter parenting and kids having, maybe free range parenting, if you want to call it that, where kids have a little more freedom, what's happening is, whereas before maybe you could say, hey, I have an errand, and you could tell your neighbor, could you watch my kids for a little bit? That doesn't really exist as much anymore, right? There's stories now where if you leave your kids alone, the neighbor is more likely to call the police, which is really, really unfortunate. And that's happening at the same time as there's not as much multi-generational caregiving, right? Whereas in previous generations, aunts, uncles, grandparents would be around and more available to take care of the grandchildren. That's decreasing. So when you have fewer hands helping taking care of the kids, these resources, early childhood education, daycare, preschool, become that much more important, especially when you think of that neurocognitive science of
is that why they're so cutthroat to get into?
That is actually another really good question. This isn't necessarily my area of expertise, but I would venture to say that because early childhood education is not compulsory, meaning it's not legally required in the United States, that really starts, that's a kindergarten in this country. The government isn't required to provide early childhood education centers, right? So there's a limited number of spaces for the families that increasingly may want to find those options for their kids, because how many families really have the luxury of staying home with their children, especially if they have more than one child, so it spans more than 5 years, to stay home full time and take care of their kids, right? And if you find that quality program where your child is getting exposure to different experiences, whether through play and socialization or academics, it's a great balance to whatever the parents can offer at home. And my kids, my youngest now is in 4th grade, but there isn't a time that I can remember where I didn't have toddlers, diapers, where you're exhausted taking care of them if you're home 24/7 with them. And I was making a joke with a friend of mine, and it was like, remember those Sunday afternoons where you're just exhausted having spent a full weekend with these kids? Because by Sunday, you're like, give me something to do, anything. I'll go anywhere. It doesn't matter if it's raining. I'll go outside, You're just desperate because it's exhausting and challenging to be stimulating your kids or to be just taking care of their needs all the time.
It is exhausting. A lot of parents look to preschool to be able to, either fill in the gaps or to supplement this education that they're getting at home or in other places. I thought it was interesting that you lived in New York and worked to get your children into the private preschools there and described that environment as so cutthroat, it's like the Hunger Games. And I want you to talk a little bit about what that environment was like and what it taught you. So,
it's a very high stakes preschool admissions process. And it's changed since I started looking at it in 2004, in that the Department of Education in the city of New York is offering preschool at least 1, if not 2 years now, prior to kindergarten. But when we were applying, it was really, really hard because there are a limited number of places at these kind of elite preschools, which a lot of families here think lead directly to the best ongoing private schools, which then...
Is that not true?
It is true for the most part, in terms of you can get or access a high quality education, except that comes, it's such an expensive, there's a sticker shock, right? It can cost $40,000 to $60,000, and that's starting at preschool. And you think about how many hours these kids are even in school, and you're like, oh my gosh, my child missed, we would do these calculations. Your child misses a day of preschool, and you're like, wow, I just burned hundreds of dollars, And then you think about, if you're sending your child to a private school, and that's not always necessary, but a lot of these preschools do lead straight to the private schools, and some of them are the best in the country, and that's K through 12, and then you do the multiplication, and you're thinking, minimum $60,000 a year times 13, and then what ends up happening is you think, okay, so these schools, at least in this segment of the population in New York, lead to the most competitive universities. And as we've seen through the recent, Varsity Blues celebrities, paying their way basically to get into the more selective universities, that it's not even a level playing field, right? So even amongst the most privileged,
expected for a long time, though,
yes,
right?
Absolutely. And it is surprising that it took so long kind of for this to make headlines, right? So it's at what point do you kind of assess the privilege versus what's good for society? And it's really, really competitive. And I will say, so I wrote this book, World Class, and I educated my 3 children in the public schools of Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tokyo, and Palo Alto, California. And so I actually saw comparatively what the preschools were like in these other countries. And it was pretty mind-blowing how absolutely different those experiences and even the application processes were, and how similar in some respects as well.
We're talking with Teru Clavel, who's sharing with us the preschool options, the things that she's learned about getting the best education possible for our kids. Okay, so you then did move, like you said, to overseas, and learned lots of different things about the preschools, the differences between the Asian schools and here in America. What did you learn?
So the first thing that I learned really when we got to Hong Kong, and at that point I had, when we arrived in 2006, I had two kids in diapers, really. But when they started their preschools at a local public preschool, the interesting thing was they had homework starting at age 3. And the homework was, even though I think about it as very simple, if you ask my eldest, who is now 15 years old, he said, oh, it was serious homework. And all he really had to do really was copy a few characters in a notebook. But I think, okay, yeah, maybe at 3 years old, maybe that was a little challenging or taxing. But it was remarkable because it got them kind of in the habit of always having homework to do. And, it's interesting to me because families will ask me, so how do you get your child to do homework, and isn't it a struggle and everything? And because all 3 of my children always had homework starting at a really young age, it's never been an issue for me because it's kind of been this thing where school is homework. It's all the same thing. And the other thing I would say in Hong Kong is because that actually was a public magnet school, the amount of money that was put into the facilities was minimal. In fact, it was nicknamed the prison. And the prison, can you imagine? And people thought I was really crazy to have enrolled my kids at this school, but it was a Mandarin.
Oh, where do your kids go? Oh, the prison.
The prison. Yeah. Are you crazy? I mean, I can use some expletives, here about how they really sometimes responded to me. But it was a Mandarin program. So my kids learned to became fluent in Mandarin at that school. And it was clear where their money was spent. It was spent on the teachers and the professional development. So that was something I learned too. It's kind of where the school is spending money. And I will say something else that was really, really notable about Japan. And we were in Tokyo from 2012 until 2016. My daughter was given so much autonomy within the school. And I want to say I would say it's probably most relatable to like a Montessori school in the US. And that, it was a 3-year preschool and the kids could wander from classroom to classroom. The older kids took care of the younger kids. It was very play-based. And there was very little teacher intervention in terms of the kids facilitating their own play and socialization. And something else that was remarkable is the teachers really kind of were adamant that the kids take care of their own things. So they had multiple bags, one for shoes, one for their notebook, one for change of clothing. And the kids were responsible for packing up their own bags every day and then going to their cubbies and their hooks and hanging everything up in the right place. And at the end of the day, doing the same and sorting, and then at home doing the same thing. And it taught such wonderful organizational skills that I still see in my daughter, which I think are remarkable. And the preschool process sets up these kids that by the time they're 6 years old and ready to start first grade, which is the start of elementary school there, they are expected to go to school, to and from school on their own, whether that be walking or with public transportation. So those 3 years set them up to be independent within the larger community. And that is phenomenal.
So your takeaway then from this experience of seeing both this work in Japan and Hong Kong as well as in the United States, what do you think that we need to change, or which direction should we go as we are educating our preschoolers and getting them ready for school success?
Well, I love that.
What's your biggest takeaway?
I love that question. I think kids, the academic stuff, and I don't want to say they have to have homework, but I think from both places, I've learned that kids should learn discipline, independence, organization at this young age because they can. And it's
right.
And
they're able to,
and it's just setting up those routines and having those limitations, right? It's kind of like when they say, even though it's really hard to discipline your child, throughout their upbringing, the kids feel safer if they have those limitations, and there isn't so much freedom where they don't feel like they're safe, like there's a safety net around them. And in all the schools where my kids were, they always had that routine. And at that age, rigor is kind of a tough word, but they did have that for that age, that level of rigor. So there were expectations of them that they could fulfill at that age. And it was, what was remarkable to me, and you know, by the time we were in Tokyo, I already had 2 older kids who'd been through preschool, so only my youngest was going through. And you know, we have these mandatory parent education sessions. And in Japan, what's interesting is you have to literally opt out by writing a letter if you could not attend the parent education. So it wasn't like you know, maybe we can go, maybe we can't.
Because you can.
Yeah, it was, you had to literally write a letter. So I would go and I would think, what do these 20-year-old teachers have to teach me? You know? And I was completely wrong. These teachers were so highly educated in the child developmental milestones of what these kids could do at 3, 4, and 5 years old, that within 5 minutes of every session that I had, I was taking notes. And they would tell me, at home, give your children chores, you know, have them when they're, you know, when they take out their shoes, make sure they know if they're clean or not. And if not, then you have to go wash them together. And, you know, make sure, in starting really early, was make sure when they come home, they go to the sink and they wash their hands and they dry their hands. And it was, and they fold their clothes. And it was this brilliant, wow. And I learned so much, even though this was my 3rd child. You know, it was amazing just to learn that these kids really can use the structure.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Teru.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. Teru's back in New York after a 10-year journey through the school system in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Tokyo, and has recently been featured on the Today Show and CNBC, CBS This Morning, and more. You can learn more about Teru and her book, World Class, at teruclavel.com. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Yeah, thank you. Oh, no, I appreciate the time. Thank you. Do you know when this might air?
Yes, this will be airing, I think the next week. We will have Emily, who is the segment producer who reached out to you, send you a link and notify you.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you, Lisa. And in the future, if you ever need someone with education background or anything comparative or local, let me know.
Absolutely. We'll give you a call back again.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
You bet.
Bye.